want to just start here by asking each of our panelists to just tell us for just a couple of minutes about what it is that they do. What do you do all day? And how does it enhance journalism, whether it's within the context of a newsroom, whether that's on the news or the business side? We have both represented here today, or as an independent developer. How are you enhancing journalism, better living through data? So we'll start with you, Brian.
Sure. Thanks, Alyssa. So that's a complicated question for me. I have sort of been in and out of a lot of different positions, in and out of media organizations, all around the sort of question of data. I guess from the sort of analytics side, I think the idea is that in the sort of current set of conditions, there is an immense amount of data that's being generated for each individual piece of content that is pushed online, and not necessarily the tools or the institutional sort of buy-in to make the most use of that data. So my sort of challenge as a developer and a data scientist is to build tools that help make that data useful to people who don't necessarily have the skills to make use of it themselves.
Okay. John, what do you do all day? And how does it enhance journalism?
Sit at my computer like we all do. So we are a team of 7 folks, the data news team, in the WNYC newsroom. So we're right in the middle of it, actually a little bit off to the side, but right in the thick of it. And we are developers, designers, investigative reporters, and editor, me. And basically we do 3 things. One thing is we help the reporters with their day-to-day data work, right? So the reporters will be getting data sets, or they will want to look for them. They will want to support their stories or explore them in different ways using data and using code, and everything from helping to sort an Excel spreadsheet to building custom scripts to mine sites or monitor sites for reporters. So we support them in that way. That's one role we have of data support. Then we are immersed in the largest projects that WNYC does, the major investigative projects. We've had several this year already that are undergirded by the data analysis that we were able to do on the team. Even if we're not visualizing it, we're often driving that and pushing that forward. And then finally, every 2 weeks now, we are making something that is useful, playful, and New York City centric, because that's fun. And we enjoy that. And it's an opportunity for us to sort of go back to our original roots a few years ago, when I sort of left the job as the news director of WNYC and started tinkering with code. And so everything from the subway agony index with emojis to the ice cream radar to a little bit more serious things like, what's the vaccination rate at my school app? So things like that.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sisi. So at ProPublica, I'm on the news apps team. We do something that's very similar to what John's team does. What's something that's incredible to me, at least, is at ProPublica, the news apps team now is about 10 people, roughly, I would say, and we started as 4, I think. And what's amazing is that every person on the team does do every part of the job. And so if we're making a project, which I can give an example of later, we do everything from the very beginning, including interview sources, and try to figure out how in the world do we get this data, whether that's hounding the government or scraping it ourselves or trying to gather it ourselves somehow, all the way to the designing and then the programming of it. And publishing it online. And something that I would say is our signature, probably, right, as in my title is the news apps part. It's a really vague term, but what that essentially means is that whether it's by itself or with a huge investigation that we're also doing, we publish these web apps that allow people to sort of find themselves in the big investigations that we do. So to give you an example, right, a big project that we did this year was about the complication rates of surgeons, and we made something called Surgeon Scorecard. And essentially, for the first time ever, and after a tremendous amount of data analysis that we did over years of time, you could read about how the fact is that it's very hard for a patient, as any one of you might be, right, to figure out exactly how well their surgeon does on an operation, right? You can ask other people for their opinions, maybe you can do some Googling, but you don't really have any real information. And what we basically did is we covered that as a story, as multiple stories, and then we made something where if you are getting an elective surgery, like a knee replacement or a hip replacement, you can look up the people that you're actually considering to be your surgeons, and we'll tell you everything we know about them, right? And so it allows you to sort of personalize that investigation to yourself, and that's really a constant theme in all of the projects that we do.
The data science group sits within the engineering division, so as Brian mentioned, the transition of news from dead trees to digital means that every interaction with news generates just abundant data. And so there's the opportunity to gather abundant data about items that are published and also just about the way people engage with the product. So the engineering team, the software engineering team, let's say, is on the business side, not in the newsroom. So in terms of church and state, we are solidly in state. Although I would say in a post-innovation report world, we are sort of one of the places identified as Switzerland, where it's sort of okay to interact with newsroom concerns and also business concerns. And so my group generally tries to learn from and make actionable the data that we gather in the process of publishing. And some of those things that are newsroom relevant are tools for quantitative audience development. So that includes sort of traditional newsroom analytics tools, as well as not just descriptive tools, but also prescriptive tools that try to help editors and audience development decide how to promote the content. We also occasionally try to be useful for acts of computer-assisted reporting and trying to help people make sense of large data sets that often require a lot of munging, I think is what data scientists call it. But because we are located within engineering, we also work on a number of traditional business concerns like building predictive models for which subscribers are likely to cancel or which non-subscribers are likely to become subscribers, which has impact on the marketing team and the product team and other teams that are interested in trying to identify risky behaviors among our subscribers or identify potential product changes that might help people enjoy the product more. Yep, thanks.
So, one thing that, a question that kind of crosses all the, you guys do different, varied work. Some of you are working on the newsroom side. Two of you are really working on the audience side. What is it in all of this work that the data sees that your colleagues who are working in more analog ways are not seeing? And can you give some specific examples? Like what is it exactly? What is the value that data is adding to the work that they're doing every day?
So yeah, I can speak to this. I think specifically in the context of producing things for the web and sort of designing things for the web, there's a lot of sort of assumptions about what particular designs or features are more engaging, more useful to users, how people interact with sites. And I think in a lot of cases, these assumptions come from the developers who make these projects. They sort of in their head think, what would I like when I come to a site? So a good example of this was something I worked on at the New York Times was a sort of typical photo gallery application. And it took many, many months to develop because they developed this sort of very sophisticated way to filter and sort the photos. And the idea was that this would, be more engaging because people could come to the page and then, find exactly the photo that they wanted. For context, this particular one was for photos of people on the red carpet over 15 years at the Oscars. And what we found when we actually looked at the data, which was sort of the first time that they were able to do this, is that an overwhelming number of people simply clicked on the first image and then clicked next, 550 times until they saw every single image that was available to them. So I think the sort of the question about what the data sees is it helps you start to question these assumptions you have as a designer, as a developer, that aren't necessarily rooted in the reality of how people experience the things that you build.
I think in the newsroom, what the data can see can obviously depends on the story, and I don't think it's new, frankly. Like computer-assisted reporting has been around for a couple decades, maybe more. But I think what's different now is that there are more programmer journalists around to dive into those projects. And actually, the notion that you could actually come up with an idea like which NYPD officers make resisting arrest callers, right? How many of them have done that? And can we answer that question? And so the questions start to get asked, and actually you can find out. And you can find out that 60% of NYPD officers have never charged somebody with resisting arrest, which we were able to figure out through a huge database with many, many tables. 40% of the officers are responsible for 100% of those charges, and 5% of them are responsible, I believe it was, for 15% of all of the resisting arrest charges. So we were able to look at this picture of resisting arrest, which is a conflict between two people and somebody, there's actually a physical interaction there. So the physical interaction between police officer and the person being arrested, that's the question we're trying to get answers to, and data is able to show that once we ask the data these questions, which again is not new. And I think what is new is that more and more people are in journalism as programmers so that analysis can be done.
Yeah, something I actually really like to talk about when we talk about why, at ProPublica, we encourage all of our reporters to be really data savvy, and they sort of love it too. And I feel really, really grateful for that. Something that seems really apparent to me, right? And this also isn't something new, but I think it's sort of been magnified by the fact that it's not just journalism that's been touched by sort of larger data sets, right? Like every field out there is being touched by the fact that there's more data available. And as journalists who are covering those fields, we need to be able to understand not only how to use that information, but what I like to tell journalism students really is that we need to know how to check up on what the experts we're interviewing are actually telling us, right? So something that happens a lot, I think, is that you interview someone, they give you access to their expertise, which is always, not always, but most of the time, very solid. And then they'll start citing some amount of information. And what's available now, especially if the data in that field is becoming more available or you know how to get it, is you can actually check whether or not what they're telling you is exactly right, or if it's being sort of spun to you in some manner, because you can now actually look at the raw data and analyze it yourself. And what's amazing, right, is that the data sets that we find that people are using are constantly riddled with errors, right? And you can then immediately go back to your expert and say, hey, I looked at this data set, this is what I found, what do you think about that? Or, it's a little different than what you told me. And oftentimes it gives you a lot of credibility in their eyes, because then suddenly, and I experience this a lot, suddenly they talk to you on a different level, right? They're like, oh, this is someone who actually understands my language, knows what I'm talking about, and we can dive a little deeper. And before, I was trying to sort of boil it down a little bit. And I think that's sort of just a raw reporting tool and also sort of a fact-checking tool for journalism.
So in terms of things that you can see with data, maybe it's useful to think about things that you do before the story is created and other things that happen after the story is born. So in terms of things that happened before a story was created, John and Sisi already alluded to computer-assisted reporting, which has been around for a while. And I think what Sisi is saying is that functional literacy and critical literacy in data science gives you like a new pair of eyes to look at things and a new spectrum in which to understand the world around you. So if somebody's telling you something with numbers, it's a lot easier now to exchange data. And sometimes you're able to access the code which allegedly did the analysis, and you can really investigate in a totally new way. I think it was Derek Wells who said that a data set is like a source, and you have to interrogate the source and appreciate the biases in that source. So there's all sorts of new ways of thinking about the act of the craft of journalism before the story is born. Separately, after the story is born, there's all sorts of ways that data can help understand the life of the story and even shape the life of the story once it's been born. Again, one insight from the innovation report is that traditionally you think about your relationship with the story as ending once you hit publish, and that's why one of the reasons the New York Times created an audience development team, in part to think through what is your relationship with the story once it's out there, once it's digitally live. So new things you can do with data are certainly dashboards. So the idea of dashboards is to take a set of metrics that would be obvious to you, like views or time spent or other things, and render them in ways that are comprehensible, usually as a function of time. And many publications, including the New York Times, have in-house solutions for dashboards. Slightly more subtle is modeling the audience. So one of the things we've been working on is how do you build models of the audience who engages with a story? Or how do you build models of what is the audience reading that's engaging with a particular section of content? So, simple questions like, I wonder what they read in France, right? To render that means that you have to make a model of the corpus of text that people in France are engaging with differently than the engagement from other countries. So that is an act of modeling, which usually you render to editors, at best, in our experience, to build some sort of interactive web app that an editor can play with. Because you can tell them the result of some fancy machine learning model, but it doesn't really get internalized unless you can really point and click and dig down and explore for yourself. A qualitatively different type of thing that I think we're trying to do is prescriptive tools. That is, tools that suggest what actions you might take after the story has been born. So an example of that is a project called Blossom, where our aim is to try to assist audience development editors who have to think about which social media channels to promote which stories on when. And that actually is a large set of things to keep in your head, because the New York Times is putting out a couple hundred URLs a day. So there's on the order of 1,000 URLs that are in play at any minute, possibly of interest to the audience. You might be interested in promoting those stories on Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Yik Yak, who knows what social channel du jour next year, and all of the sub-accounts for all of those social media channels. And then you have to think about what to do every, say, half hour or 15 minutes, or whatever frequency you're willing to engage in. So as great as your sense of news judgment is, that's just a lot of data to keep in your head at once. So we built this prescriptive approach. We built a predictive algorithm that would suggest to editors which piece of content might be best served on different channels at different times of day, and then built that as a data product by integrating it into a Slack bot, so that the editors never need to leave Slack to ask Blossom, what's the social history of this story? How has it already been promoted? Blossom bot, what might you suggest that I promote next, and in which ways? And sometimes Blossom bot can actually interrupt the chat and say, no, seriously, you really need to promote this story. It's going to be great. So there actually is an interruptive effect to Blossom as well. So I guess those are some ways of slicing what you can see with data.
So Chris, building on what you're saying now, I mean, you described work that really in some ways crosses over. You said you were on the state side of the church-state divide, state being the business side of the newsroom, church being the news side of the newsroom. Are there ways in which you see this work you're doing as it unfolds, and this is a question for anyone too, actually changing the nature of that church-state relationship? Is it breaking down the walls, rebuilding them in some way? Does the data affect that in ways that you're seeing in play?
I mean, I think the method of conveying the news has changed completely. And again, one of the explicit recommendations of the innovation report was for all of us to rethink the pros and cons of church-state divide. And if your experience of news is so very much mediated by the digital experience under which the news is conveyed, it just opens up so many ways of thinking about not only digital journalism and the craft of storytelling, but also all the ways that we can study how the audience engages with that content, before, during, and after publish time.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because both of our newsroom panelists here are also from nonprofit newsrooms specifically, which have very particular dynamics and needs and ways of working with their audiences. And one thing I think is certainly of interest to me about how both WNYC and ProPublica work is that they're really in constant dialogue with their audiences in ways that sort of by necessity kind of go beyond what most commercial newsrooms do. And one question I was asking them before we got started here was just crowdsourcing and engaging with those audiences and how you do it. So I wanted to hear a little bit from both of you about how that fits into your model, both in terms of building projects, building stories, and reporting, and also in terms of building the audiences, donors, whatever it is that you need to survive.
I'm at WNYC, New York Public Radio, and our whole enterprise runs on crowdsourcing. If you haven't yet given, please do. If you have already, thank you. You've probably heard that. We go out and we ask people to support us in this very sort of raw way. Also, we've been inviting people to call in forever, right, on the talk shows, and so we have sort of a robust history of that, and we have a business model that's based on it. I think what now we're doing in the newsroom and sort of through social media and other ways, we are definitely engaging in our audience in different ways. We're even working with ProPublica on an engagement project right now. There are ways that we are asking our audience for participation in these other ways. In this case, we're asking for very specific cases where people may be basically cheated out of money in their leases. But it's a very specific case that has to meet certain conditions. We have a whole bunch of people who have actually said, yes, that might be me, so that's amazing. And then we also say, like, hey, it's snowing, what's your favorite sledding spot? And you put that on a map, and that becomes this useful tool for people who want to find a sledding spot. So it runs the gamut. Recently, in terms of crossing the church-state stuff, I think one way we do this is we say, hey, you participated in this crowdsource. As you sign up for this, as you put your sledding spot on, do you want to join our newsletter? And that establishes a relationship, and the relationship leads to maybe 3 years from now a membership, right? We also, in fact, for the sleep project, we did a thing where you had to actually keep track of how much you slept every night if you wanted to participate. For that, you had to actually log in. It's not something we usually do, but we needed to be able to give your data back to only you. So that also established a relationship. And then, very frankly, going back to the Pledge Week, if we've done something that's stuck in your brain as an amazing piece of journalism, investigative journalism with data, or that subway emoji thing, that was awesome, and it just makes you go, yeah, this time I'll give them some money, sure. Then I feel like we're sort of beyond clicks and reach and things like that, where that's sort of what I'm hoping is possible. So.
I feel like I should start asking people to donate to ProPublica more often. I would say, so we have dabbled in both avenues as well, right? More so in the crowdsourcing for reporting purposes. And for us, since we are an investigative news organization, right, the natural answer is we ask people to help us investigate things. And I do find that people really engage with that very deeply if they choose to engage. So, for example, something that we've run for a long time now is this Facebook group on patient safety, essentially. And it grew from nothing, right? One of our reporters wanted to create it, see if he could cultivate sort of a community of people. And now it sort of just runs with us simply as like logistical moderators, and people have found a community aside from us completely, and they're helping each other when something happens in a hospital, right? And they feel like they've been wronged or they don't know how to deal with a certain situation. And we've been able to use that group and sort of also other investigations we've done in the past to say to people, have you been harmed, right? For some reason in a hospital or at your doctor's office, tell us about it. And we have this really crazy, like I did this presentation earlier this year where I went to go look because I had not filled out the questionnaire before and it wasn't my project. And I went to go look at the questionnaire. It is like more than 4 full pages of detailed questions that we ask people. And so far we've had more than 1,000 people, I think, fill it out. And that was incredible for us because it is such detailed information that could become sources for us, but also now we're doing some real data analysis off of the information we got. And we do similar things like that too, right? Where we ask people, maybe 2 election cycles ago, we're trying to figure out how any presidential campaign is targeting you in your emails, right? In those emails that we all get every like 2 days sometimes. And we ask people, if you are getting them, forward them to us. And we'll sort of give you some feedback and say, is your email any different from someone else's? And if enough people email us, we can show all the different versions that sort of showed up. That kind of sort of participatory, you get something out of it too type of experience. And that's been pretty cool. In terms of the actual like business editorial divide at ProPublica, I would say we're probably 50 people now, and 40 of us are probably newsroom and 10 are on the business side. And it's not something that I really think about that often. Like I've worked at other news organizations before and it was really just like obvious, like newsroom is on its own floor and like, you know, you have to like go through this special hallway to get to the other side. But at ProPublica, you know, we all see each other. If I stand up, I see everybody who works at ProPublica. And sometimes we have ideas in the newsroom that flow over to business. And so like a really simple one is, I think 2 years ago, we process a lot of data and we thought, well, hey, we can give people the data that we get from the government for free. But if we spend, say, like 2 years trying to like munge through a data set and creating it for one of our projects, we can sell it at some sort of modest price to people who are either doing research or other journalists if they want the entire thing raw, as opposed to using what we created for the public. Or, you know, if you're a corporation that wants to use it for business, we charge you a special price. And that's sort of just an idea that happened. And then we built it on the editorial side. We were like, hey, like if people want to buy it, we'll see how this goes, right? And now we recently hired a new person on our business side who is going to spend some of her time specifically thinking about how can we sort of do more with the data store. And we sort of handed it over, but we're still the creators. And so we help give ideas and things like that. And so those sorts of relationships, I feel like, are quite spontaneous in our newsroom, but isn't something that happens like every day either.
Do people ever buy back their own data once you've gone through and cleaned it?
I don't know, actually. Not that I know of, but there have been very strange requests sometimes that we get because we have a data store. Well, people will be like, can I buy can I buy not only the data, but also the app that you made with the data? And we're like, that is an odd question. Why would you need such a thing? And people always have reasons. So.
Yeah.
Have you had any sort of public blowback at all for creating a data store, considering you're a nonprofit funded by donors and foundations, and now you're like selling the byproducts of your work?
Yeah, that's a really good question because that was something that I was like, is this going to happen? Like when we released it, I think 2 years ago at the NICAR conference, which is the conference that a lot of data journalists go to, and we sort of announced it there. And I was like, are people going to be like, how dare you sell data or sell anything, right? Like, how dare you sell anything? I don't think we've seen anything regarding blowback at all. And maybe it's because of the prices, and maybe it's because we also give a ton of data away for free. And so the data store itself is sort of tiered. And so we have these huge projects that we have literally worked on for, say, like 5 years or something like that. And if you are a journalist and you want the whole data set cleaned by us, like labeled by us, we create like this how-to guide for how to use it. I think it's like $200 or something like that. But then if you just want the raw data we got from the government, it's totally free. And we created sort of our own guide to that as well. And you just download that, right? And so maybe it's because of the prices or because we give stuff away. Sometimes even if it is processed data and we really want other people to use it, we give it away too. So I don't know, no blowback.
Interesting. Well, Brian, I wanted to ask you, because I mean, one of the things that's so, whether nonprofit, for-profit, newsrooms want to be able to measure their impact, like beyond the metrics, beyond sales if there's sales, beyond the clicks. What, I know you worked on news links. Like, what is it that you've done to help us make sense of all this data that's out there about impact?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's not spoken enough about, clearly everyone understands that in a digital era, a single piece of content generates a tremendous amount of data. Of course, that data doesn't necessarily capture the things that are most meaningful or important to us. One thing, for instance, which I won't go into deeply, but I think there's, for instance, a dearth of any sort of information collected on the effort a newsroom puts into their work. There's no sort of measurement of, from an editor, what do I think is the quality of this piece of journalism? How many reporting hours did I spend on this? How many reporters worked on this story? These sort of things would be tremendously valuable in trying to sort of get a sense of this relationship between, on one hand, the effort a news organization puts into a piece of work, and then on the other hand, the outcome, what sort of impact it has on it. The sort of particular issue of impact is very much sort of relevant to nonprofit news organizations where clicks aren't necessarily their currency. Whereas a for-profit news organization relies on advertising revenue, many nonprofit news organizations rely on foundation funding, and many of these foundations now, sort of following the aid and international development communities, have sort of started to take up this banner of impact. And what that essentially means is when we give you a grant, we're less interested in how you're using that grant to generate revenue for your organization, but more so in how you are leaving some sort of societal impact behind. And what's very difficult about that, of course, is that it's an extremely subjective thing. It's very hard to measure. And so one thing that I did with Newslinks, which is a project I did with the Tao Center at Columbia, was try to develop a system whereby people could start to quantify these very sort of qualitative things. As I was explaining to the other panelists, this sort of came out from a particular discussion I had with Glenn Cramon, who was at that time the managing editor for investigative stories at the New York Times, and also the person in charge of submitting Pulitzer Prize applications. So his sort of process for doing that was very analog. Anytime he would sort of hear about any sort of thing that would happen in the world, he would make a little note, he'd scribble it down, he'd print something out from his computer, and he'd stuff it in a manila envelope. And then at the end of the year, he would have, maybe 8 to 10 of these envelopes for each of their, leading enterprise stories. And he could tell by looking at the envelopes, which ones had the greatest impact simply by how thick they were. So I think one of the challenges in terms of this sort of impact measurement is how do we take that process that many people are sort of already doing. Many journalists sort of do this for their own portfolios, their own resumes. If you're a journalist and you particularly care about an issue that you're reporting on, you're most likely going to sort of follow that issue and try to track what sort of impact it had. So I think in the coming years, we'll start to see a lot more sophistication around that particular process.
What's so interesting about Newslinks and so many of the projects that we're talking about is that it really is, Newslinks is open source, I believe.
Right, yeah. Newslinks is an open source software application. All of the code is available on GitHub. Sorry, I forgot to plug it.
But this really speaks to, right? So much journalism code is on GitHub. I know ProPublica makes use of it. GitHub if you don't know, is a repository for code of all kinds, but particularly beloved by journalists. And we have a real amazing culture of kind of sharing and collaboration and some friendly competition, to be sure, but among data journalists and people who use data to enhance journalism in general. So wanted to see if any of the panelists wanted to speak to that. Just sort of what is it about? Why is it so collaborative? Because I thought, aren't we in an industry of sort of Darwinian struggle for survival? And why is it that the data folks are so collaborative and happy?
I think part of it, and we're a happy bunch. I think that part of it is that it goes back again to the investigative reporting history. It's sort of like, look, I'm not interested. I'm not going to give away my story, but how do you process these, magnetic tapes or whatever it was that that journalists were trying to do? And there are only a few people who sort of had figured that out, and they just shared their techniques. Again, it's often it'll be the code and it'll be the techniques and then the data too, but after the story comes out, right? You don't give away your story. But then it's like, hey, go do this in your community or give this a whirl, or here's how you navigate this data bureaucracy, or here's how you parse this file. And I think that's what happened. And what's really interesting is that really truly has grown into this very robust open source community. I don't know how many of you are programmers, and I'm a new programmer, but my understanding is that a lot of what is on these public repositories never gets touched again, even though people may open source their code. But in journalism, people are using each other's stuff all the time and developing new things and sharing it. And the Wall Street Journal just said, "Hey, here's the locator map app that we use. Here, have it." And you're just kind of like, "Wow, I was gonna make something like that. Now I don't have to." And so I think that's pretty cool. I think there's two things that are really cool. I think there's a spirit of openness, and I also think that there's a little bit more of a spirit of mission. We're all trying to provide information to everybody, and yeah, we might want to do our story first, but in the end, we're all trying to inform and shed light on what's out there in government and elsewhere. You have thoughts on that?
So the other thing that I would just add is, we open source our code, but we also open source our practices. And so something that ProPublica has on our GitHub is also like the ProPublica News App styles and also our bulletproofing guide, right? So if you have a ton of data, and this is something that I find a lot of organizations struggle with too, and they ask me about this a lot, which is like, how do you fact check like 50 million pages that you're publishing full of data, right? And we're like, we have a process for that. And if you want to know more about it, go to our GitHub and like read literally all of the steps that we make sure that we do to fact check that much data at once. But then on the flip side too, right, is being open and sharing information. There's sort of the code practices side, and then there's sort of the expertise side of how do you deal with sort of the data, or how do you deal with the tools that you can now use. And something we have at ProPublica is called reporting recipes. And essentially we write them whenever we feel like we have a story that a lot of journalists can benefit from, and save them tons of time from poring over it like we did, and say, okay, here are 5 things you need to know about this data set. And if you're investigating any city in America, here are the 5 numbers you should look at. And if you see these patterns, like, now it's time for you to investigate XYZ and like go talk to experts about this. And here, like, we just pull them out for you so that people have an easier time, and then make that sort of data more accessible to people. And I don't know if it's because like we are super into doing that because we're a nonprofit and our goal is impact, right? So the more journalists that take this data into their hands and actually produce something that is important to their local audience, like we would love that so much. But at the same time, like, just going to the community, you can ask a question on like a listserv and you'll get an answer within minutes on a technique, like, how do I do this? What's the best software to do this? What books should I read if I want to learn this? And it's just like, it's incredible. And I don't know exactly why it is that this group of people is so open, but maybe it's just because like the landscape changes so fast from day to day and week to week that we're all trying to learn, and there's sort of no monopoly on expertise, right? It's like we're all trying to help each other out because there's so much more to learn after this.
I think also the root, I think there's some trace back to investigative reporters and editors, which is an organization that it has for years brought together investigative reporters, always had tip sheets. Like you're looking at same day cash places, check cashing places. Oh, we did that over in Texas. Here's how you can do it in your community. And that was always, even forget about the data, that's just like, here's who you call, here's who regulates this, here's who does this. And I think it kind of spun, it feels like to me, having seen that, it spun a little bit out of that as well.
So there's also a reproducibility angle to it, which is if your story that you're telling is about some computational analysis, then the code is part of the story. And this is particularly true in computational research, whether it's linguistics or computational physics. It's recognized in those communities that when you publish a paper about something that you believe is true, and it's true irrespective of who said it, part of what's incumbent on you in telling that story is to share the code or sometimes the data that allowed you to reveal that truth. So I do think there's a reproducibility angle to it. You can go to github.com/theupshot and see a bunch of the GitHub repos associated with different stories. The other sort of cultural part of that, I think, is just the software engineering community is very pro-open source and has become more pro-open source every year, in part because open source software is getting better and better every year. So my group is building tools on top of Python, which is an open source project, or R, which is an open source project. All the sort of weapons grade statistical software now is open source tools. And a lot of tech companies make it regular practice to release open source their tools. So like this week, Google open source TensorFlow, which is a machine learning algorithm code base. And that's just part of what software engineers do. So as those cultures come together, like the truth-telling community and the software engineering tool sharing and tool building community, it's just sort of natural to be sharing your code and your tools.
Okay, I would like to open up the floor to questions. While we're waiting for folks to line up, I will just ask one more question to the panel, which is just, how do each of you in your own work manage not to be overwhelmed by there's so much data out there of all kinds, and each of us in our own work has practices to find our way through that sea, right, and shine a light in there. I'm mixing metaphors here, but you know what I mean. So I want to hear from each of you sort of what your sort of practice is, right? To sort of say, okay, this is good, relevant information that actually is meaningful, whether it's for storytelling, whether it's for figuring out audience. Sort of do you get a funny feeling in the pit of your stomach? Do you have a litmus test that you use to sort of say, aha, I know that is good data? And not, because again, it's so easy to be overwhelmed, I think, for all of us working with it.
Part of it, I think that's part of a statistical training, whether you were formally trained as a statistician or not. There's a famous statistics paper called Statistical Modeling in Shoe Leather that's about exactly all this shoe leather work that a statistician does to think about how can I get my hands on data that are relevant to this effect that I think is out there in nature. So some of it is having an intuition for where the data might be that are relevant to the effect, and also how much work it would be to use those data. Sometimes, we're thinking about some particular data set that we could get your hands on, but it's just so darn hard for one reason or another to work with that data set. You should just use something else that's often correlated with that anyway, or something like that.
Well, so we definitely have litmus tests for what is bad data, right? Like, and you run into this so much, like, schools' data sets asking that reports for each high school how many AP classes are offered, and people saying numbers that are just like literally impossible, like 2,000 AP courses or something like that. Or if you like add up columns that are meant to be states and there's like a state missing, or like things like that. But in terms of actually finding insight for me, oftentimes it's actually understanding the data enough so I know what's in it, but then it's all about external research from the data. And so, for example, I think my second year at ProPublica, we made this app called Nonprofit Explorer that is essentially a research app that allows people to look through 990 data that the IRS had released that was digital, and then also the PDFs. It was completely free, and I think that's what really set it apart at the time. But then we were also trying to figure out, like, what stories can we tell from this, right? And I didn't really know anything about 990s. And so the first thing I did was, like, read all of these pieces or research articles on, like, what is useful to know on the 990, but then also, like, what fields, if people filled them out that way, are a huge red flag, right? And what was kind of fun is, like, a kind of funny story about this is that we found this one field. I don't remember the exact wording anymore, but basically you have the option to check like yes or no. And the question is something along the lines of like, did you like cheat on your like accounting last year or something like that, right? It was just like, it's some obvious like, you should say no to this question kind of wording. And we found like 50 organizations or something like that all said yes. And ProPublica was like, all right, well, let's call them, see what happens. And it turns out like most of them were all like, oh, we made a mistake when we checked that. And then we filed like an amendment saying, never mind, like we did not do that last year. And it was just like peculiar, like one, people don't actually know how to fill it out very well, which is something that we learned because it is meant to be for so many different types of organizations, like shoved into one form. But then ultimately, I also learned that there is no default red flag. There's no sort of like basic analysis that I can do on it and say, if you meet all of these requirements, then there's something definitely wrong with your organization because the form has to fit so many different things.
This question is for Chris. You had mentioned earlier that you are building or have built a tool to help align the story with the correct social channel. So I'm interested to see, what type of parameters do you set to connect that story with the best suited channel?
Yes. Let's see, what is publicly disclosable about that? I don't know that there's a lot I can say about what attributes of the story turn out to be particularly important. I mean, the qualitative thing I can say is that building that involves a lot of iteration with actual newsroom people. So we try not to go in and tell people in the audience development team what attributes of the story we think will be important, or what of the many different ways you can quantify engagement we think are the sacred ways. It's actually very iterative working with them to figure out what are the sort of success metrics that they think are capturable. But in terms of what parameters of the story are predictive, I invite you to come work at the New York Times, and I'm happy to disclose it thereafter. Okay.
Questions?
I'm curious, when releasing tools like ProPublica did with the nonprofits, do you get any blowback from companies like GuideStar that are already doing that for a profit? Like, you're releasing tools that they're making money off of. Do they have any reaction to that?
What am I allowed to say? I'll say this. We have gotten blowback from companies that do what we do for money. It has never been so serious that, like, there's some sort of like angry shouting scene in a movie and then like someone leaves in a huff. It's never been kind of like that. But people definitely are not overjoyed when we sort of like free all the data in their business model. But at the same time, we are constantly trying to provide people with information that we think they deserve to have, because usually the government has it. And something I like to say a lot is like, if the government did literally everything that we did, right, which is all things that are services they could provide, like Nonprofit Explorer, then I would just be out of a job, because like a lot of what I do is sort of making sure that normal people have access to all this information. And there are a lot of companies that sort of monetize based on that fact. But I mean, it's never been so serious where like people have like come banging on our doors demanding that we shut it down. No one has ever actually said like, you can't do this, like, how dare you? But rather, like, we've gotten like sort of alarmed phone calls, like, what are your plans with this in the future? Like, what is going to be coming? So, I mean, I don't know what to say to those people.
Folks can see it. Are there any analytics of how data stories are received by your audience in your organizations? I had my own similar question to that, so I'll piggyback on this, which is just to ask what, I think most, if not all, news organizations now do, pretty basic analytics certainly with the social media. Are there interesting ways that you or other organizations are really building on that in ways that might be unexpected, fresh, worth knowing about, that you'd want to share?
So the data news team started when I saw that folks like ProPublica and the New York Times were doing these projects, these apps, these like bring the story home to you, right? So you had the sort of macro and micro stories, and it was a little bit weird to be doing visuals and maps and stuff at a public radio station, by the way, or sort of based in audio, as you might think. And so one of the things I did early on is I just made sure that I put tracking stuff. So there was Chartbeat and there was Google Analytics on the individual thing, not just the page that it was being served on, but the individual thing that we were building. And we actually made them, and we still do, we make them embeddable in other places. Well, what happened was there was this hurricane that came through, Hurricane Irene, and we had made a map that allowed you to look up your evacuation zone. Then the mayor said the Zone A had to be evacuated, and everybody had to figure out if they were in Zone A. So they all went to the city, and the city's computer crashed. And the only map that worked was this little one that we built, and it was sitting there. And it wasn't very sophisticated, but it did the job, and it had Google tracking code in it. So when places started embedding this all over the world, we knew how many people were doing it. And I will just say that, yeah, clicks and embeds aren't everything, but when 1 million hits had come in over a couple of days, that has never happened before, which was the case then, people are like, hey, let's do more of that. So I think that just the active tracking, not just and we try to do more now with Google Events and other things where we can keep track of not only did you embed this, but how many slides did you go through, or how many random names did you generate for schools, or something like that. So we try to keep track of those things to see if what we're doing is doing what we think it was going to do, and then we adjust accordingly. I don't know if that answers it, but it's sort of atomizing the tracking has been helpful.
We hear about these companies like Data Miner that are really helping news organizations to find out about news that's happening way before maybe their reporters know. Do you see yourselves using more and more of those kinds of data mining companies in the future, or are you going to do it all in-house?
I mean, I'll say we don't use that. I don't know that we're not really necessarily I mean, we do breaking news. We're not. Maybe not in that sort of way. I don't know. I guess it's not something that we're actively using. I guess I can say that.
I mean, I can talk from the perspective of, yeah. So I used to work at a data mining company called Enigma, and tried very, very hard to develop partnerships with journalists and journalism organizations. What I found was that in most cases, the people that are equipped to deal with the data would much rather prefer that they are the ones to do the investigation, to do the cleaning, to do the munging, because if they aren't the ones to do it and there is some problem on our end, they are then held liable for those mistakes. So I think there's always going to be a difficulty when using third-party data providers as an investigative journalist, simply because if there's something wrong and you have no way of repairing that, you're going to be held accountable for that. So that's one difficulty. I think, yeah.
Okay, the mic.
I have two questions for you. One is, when it comes to faster news, breaking news, how do you guys change gears and bring data journalism to bear on that in a successful way? And also at Vocative, where I work, running a small kind of growing data viz unit there, we have now about 80% mobile audience. How does that factor into what stories you choose, how you go about maybe telling complex data in a way that's going to work for the majority of your audience who are on a small screen?
So on the data team, when there is breaking news, and for us, breaking news at WNYC is maybe a little bit different than every other organization. When it's really big and it's a big civic issue, like Hurricane Sandy, or something, or a fire in the East Village, or something like that. We're really thinking, and by fire I mean like the building that collapsed, and the big, not just an apartment fire, but the whole building disappeared. So the things that are going to have an impact on our community, not just that are just maybe interesting and breaking. We spend a lot of time, as much time as we can in a moving situation, trying to figure out what our audience is going to need next. We did that with Sandy, and we really thought every step of the way, basically every 12 hours, we were like, okay, what do they need to know next? What's going to happen next? We need to know about where the hurricane is. We need to know about where the rain is. We need to know about where the flooding is. We need to know where subways are closed. We need to know when they're opening. And we tried to think ahead. And it's really important because coding on deadline is a really tricky thing to do. And so the more prescient we can be, the better off we are. Sometimes we make mistakes. We had this great idea for the LIRR strike. It was going to be amazing. You all would have known about it. And it never happened. So.
I like to joke a lot that at ProPublica, when breaking news happens, we just consume it. But it's interesting because there's a lot of stuff that when I first started at ProPublica, I just come from the Washington Post, right? And there would be a lot of political breaking news in which it would be my gut reaction to say like, oh, we have to cover this, right? Not because it was just political, but because like, in my head, it was like, well, investigative journalism is about enabling sort of like, citizens to know about corruption, things like that. And like politics is so intertwined with that world. But in fact, we don't jump at literally everything because we are constantly working on these large investigations. When it comes to the data journalism side specifically, we've done a lot of stuff this year in particular around sort of planned breaking news. So we don't have much information before, but we know something's going to happen on a certain day. And on things like that, it's sort of like where the whole team comes together, right? Like everybody is working on everything and trying to figure out like, what can we make that is accurate and that we won't like regret tomorrow that we made it and gave it to people. We've done that sort of, I think, twice this year. Once around a big data release. Well, I guess both around two big data releases. The second one, which was one that I worked on, we had like, I don't know, maybe two weeks advance notice. That's like pretty good, right? Compared to maybe 3 weeks advance notice compared to normal breaking news. But this is sort of like the Department of Education said, we are going to release this huge amount of data that has never sort of been out before. And for any of you who follow education news, President Obama last year had sort of proclaimed like, the Department of Education is going to create a college rating system. And then they nixed that idea. And what we had found out was essentially the data behind it was going to come out. But we there was literally so much data that it took us like a whole week just to understand it at all. And there were so many columns, something like 2,000 to 3,000 columns, not to mention sort of like then understanding the complexities of the data itself. And what we did in that case is sort of what I think the software world often does, which is you release a very minimum viable product, right? We released basically the bare minimum of what we could get done by the time it was going to release. And then for probably the whole month after, every week we were adding new features that we wish we could have built beforehand. And every time we did, we sort of tweeted about it and told people about it. And that's sort of how we handle it that way. And like, John's right, like data journalism on deadline is really difficult because a lot of things that you would want time to say, call an expert and verify that you're not totally screwing this up or that, there isn't some like critical thing that you don't know about, right? It's hard to do on deadline because people aren't available like that to you. And for us, it's sort of like working around it. Sometimes we say, we've done this once where we basically say, we're not going to compete on the breaking news side because we can't do this well enough to our own satisfaction. And we will come out with something in a month that we are totally confident with. And we've done that and it's worked well for us too.
How about a mobile? I do want to hear about that as well. And then we...
Before that,
yes.
Just two other things on the breaking news thing. One is because we are kind of the data geeks and we're like diving into all of the government data sets all the time, often one way we do respond is we're supporting our on-air folks and our online folks in ways that they might not have thought of. We had a boat slam into the ferry dock over here a couple of years ago, and like we knew where the records for that boat were online right away. And so we went to it and we were like, oh, this thing has hit this dock before. And it was the steering problem. And it actually, we aired that. We were the first ones to do that. Turned out later, the NTSB said, oh, it's the steering problem again. So we've done that because, and I would say that the geeks in the newsroom kind of thing, Michael Keller at Al Jazeera America, I don't know what inspired him, but at some point, I don't know if you've ever taken the Amtrak, when you get on the Wi-Fi, it shows a little map of where your train is and how fast it's going. So Michael Keller, I don't know how long ago, decided that would be a good thing to just look at every couple of minutes and take the data off of that site. And then so when the train derailed outside of Philadelphia, he knew how fast it was going. Because it was he had slurped the data down, and so, but that was just running. That was not. I mean, talk about prescient. That was just like data geek going. That's interesting data. Let's hang on to that. It might be useful someday. So that's another way. In terms of mobile, I mean, everybody knows that's where everything is going. It's all of our folks. So many folks are using. our content on in mobile, and so for data visualization, that's a challenge. How do you visualize things on a little tiny screen? You can't make this huge big graphic. You have to figure it out. But that's something that we just kind of wrestle with every day, and it's top of mind. There are many, probably most now, the projects that we start that way. We start with how are you gonna experience this online? I think everybody's doing that. And it poses some interesting challenges, but yeah, it's just another thing to tackle.
I think it takes a lot of practice. So New York Times is a very large news organization, so it can do some things owing to scale. Like for the breaking news question, part of it is everyone in the newsroom has his or her own tolerance for distractions, and different people are following Twitter or other platforms with different intensity. And then they have their communications channels practiced for getting that information to other journalists who might be relevant to that particular story or that particular topic. So, sitting on the Slack channel on the New York Times, you see a lot of people following things that are happening and alerting it to people who are likely to be wanting to write a story about that. And when breaking news happens, you really can see just the muscles of the organization and everybody go to work in a way that is practiced. In fact, there was a tweet on Friday night about the Paris attacks. Somebody from the newsroom was saying it's amazing and sad to watch how well people come together and execute in times of tragedy. Sad because the tragedies happen, and yet amazing to watch how practiced it is for everybody to come together. And on the particular topic of data journalism, right away there were interactives and maps. Part of that is practice and habit. Part of that is attention to tooling, to make sure that you have built the right tools so that it's easy for you to spin up a graph, a map with the look and feel that people are used to.
I can also attest to the fact that the New York Times regularly prepares obituaries for people who have not died yet. So that's another technique.
Yeah. Or when Joe Biden decided not to run, they said, here's the story that we already had written for what we would have said if Joe Biden decided to run.
Okay, and with that, we are going to wrap up. I want to thank our panelists, Brian Abelson, John Keefe, Sisi Wei, and Chris Wiggins, and thank all of you in the Daily News Innovation Lab. Thank you for coming, and stay here and enjoy.